You know the town, the one just over the county line. The one with the good Chinese restaurant and the movie theater that smells of popcorn. Good smell. Good people. My stake in the town, a business, a building. That is when I finish paying off the mortgage in 15 years. I assume I'll be around in 15 years. That's something you have to assume, or else there's no point in assuming. No one thinks about it much anymore. Too many crises, too many scares. So we push it to the back of our minds, where it waits, staring, bright-eyed, silent, more or less. Number of family fallout shelters planned or begun in our town in the last 2 years, 189. Number completed, 5.
They're gonna live in my fallout shelter. So if you want...
Some say it was apathy, indifference. Others say it was all that talk about standing at the door of your home shelter with a gun and shooting your neighbor down if he tried to get in. That didn't sit well with our people. But the coming of the National Shelter Survey and the idea of finding community shelter for everyone seemed to put the matter in a brand new light.
Schools, hospitals, commercial buildings, apartment houses. 168 potential community shelters which could accommodate our entire population, plus any additional shoppers or workers who might be in the area during an attack.
The hypothesis then, Mr. Mayor, is a nuclear attack.
William Albemarle Groves, senior member of our Common Council, and one of the town's most trusted and respected citizens.
That is the hypothesis, Mr. Groves.
Unlikely, but possible from a military point of view.
Your job depends upon accepting that as a premise, does it not?
Dennis J. Allen, our Civil Defense Director.
Shall we continue, gentlemen?
By all means.
The use of private structures will, of course, be up to the individual owners. But people like School Trustee McCardle have allowed the government to survey their buildings, to mark them as shelters, and to stock them with essential supplies.
Well, don't make a hero out of me, Mr. Mayor. I was opposed to the idea at first, but the people in my building wanted a shelter, and I wanted to make them happy. It was just good business.
Well, underneath it all, people like to know that there's somewhere to go if it happens. A bank, a store basement, a school.
Why a school? They're located where people live. They're usually the most substantial buildings in the neighborhood, and the children are there during most of the daylight hours. That's a quarter of your population to begin with.
Our 8 school buildings could protect 5,000 people from nuclear fallout.
At what cost, Mr. Mayor?
For Jackson High, virtually nothing. For Grammar School 2, additional ventilation at a cost of $5 per person sheltered. For Grammar Schools 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, modifications at a cost of $40 per person sheltered. For Grammar School 7, now under construction, an additional cost of $35,000. Total cost of all modifications combined, $163,125.11.
To be paid by whom?
By the people, naturally.
Will the doors of these shelters be thrown open to everyone?
The schools always did belong to everyone.
Who's to pay for supplies for these shelters?
All stocked by the federal government. Food, water, medicine, radiation measuring instruments.
Yes. Who guards these supplies against vandalism? Who administers the shelters, conducts shelter drills, trains the people in medical aid and in the use of these radiological gadgets?
Well, those things can be worked out.
Or dropped entirely, Mr. Mayor. Not only is this not a matter for the schools, but in times like these, I can think of no more futile, negativistic approach than burrowing into the ground, and at these staggering costs.
We can raise the money.
And do without furniture, books, a cafeteria for Grammar School 2, more teachers for Grammar Schools 3 and 5, where we already have more than 40 pupils in a class.
We want them to be 40 live pupils.
I want them to be 40 live pupils too. But I deny the issue is survival. Because for the first time in human affairs, to kill is to be killed, and to let live is to live. An uneasy balance, to be sure, but the beginnings of peace. Now, if we're going to spend our money, let's spend it bolstering peace. Best fallout protection we have.
We all believe in working for peace, but that doesn't mean we can't take reasonable measures for defense.
What is a reasonable defense against total destruction? Tell me what will be left for those people when they come up out of their holes.
Shall we begin with life?
Councilman Groves, for all his strong opinions, is not an unreasonable man. He was willing, as I was, to let Mr. Allen point out exactly what changes the government thought would be needed to incorporate shelter facilities into our schools. There was a lot of technical talk, Rankins, PSIs, protection factor 100. But it all came down to something simple, the ABCs of fallout protection. The walls and ceilings have to be thick enough to withstand deadly amounts of radiation. And if they're not, you make them thicker. And when all is done and you're protected by thick basement walls, you have to breathe, which means a system of ventilation. And drink, which means a plan for storing water. But I learned that basements aren't the only place to find fallout protection. We saw a room that opened on an air shaft and was shielded from every direction by heavy brick walls. This would give the room a high degree of fallout protection, even though it's above ground. Rooms like this, and windowless rooms in the core of a building, can increase the shelter capacity quite a good deal. God grant they never have to be used. A few days later, Dennis Allen requested permission to present his case for school shelters before the full membership of the Common Council. He elected to do so by showing us films that arrived from Paducah, Kentucky. The Concord School had basement windows just below ground level. The windows had to be shielded. A local contractor donated cement blocks. The men of the town laid the blocks and shoveled earth between the blocks and the building foundation. Then flowers were planted along the new wall of defense. An independent power supply was installed for pumping water and providing lights. Eventually, the new shelter for 600 persons was stocked with a 2-week supply of food, which is maintained at all times. If Paducah could do that much by itself, why couldn't we do as well?
Well, gentlemen, what's your opinion?
Gentlemen, I have a list here of some 370 items vitally needed by the public.
It was quite a list. It not only covered our schools, but took in everything else needed by other departments of our city government. And it was obvious that, in his opinion, all these needs were more immediate and far more urgent than fallout protection. And so it went for 45 costly minutes before he moved that the council table the motion, put the proposal aside, at least for the time being, which in this case could mean forever. The count, 2-4, 3 against any immediate consideration of putting shelter in our schools. Dennis Allen does not give up easily. he persuaded Mr. Groves to accompany him to a model community shelter that had been set up in a neighboring county. A shelter that doubles as a meeting place for civic groups, proving that money for fallout shelters can also buy useful peacetime facilities. Allen also demonstrated the use of what Groves had called a radiological gadget, a dosimeter. Then showed him the supplies provided by the federal government. But if a change was forthcoming in Groves, the dent was still to be made.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry Mr. McCardle's out to lunch, but I'm sure I can help you.
I'm flying to Capital City next Monday. I want to pick up some travel insurance.
Certainly. That's Monday the 22nd.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Round trip ticket?
Yes.
Now, who do you want as a beneficiary on this?
Mrs. Alice Groves, 29 Cedar Lane.
Mm-hmm. And second beneficiary?
Holly Groves, age 12.
Mm-hmm. Now, how much insurance do you want?
Well, I should think about 500.
Hello, Bill.
Oh, George.
I'll take over, Freddie.
Fine.
Thank you.
Travel insurance?
Yes,
Good policy.
I'm sure it is. Why did you do that?
Simple. I don't want you to waste your money.
But you said it was a good policy.
Do you realize what your chances are of being killed in an airplane crash?
No.
About 1 in 350,000. Practically negligible.
People are killed.
People are, that's true. But chances are not you with odds like that. I'm sure you can find better ways to spend your money.
Well, George, I'm not doing this for myself.
Yes, you mentioned your wife and child as beneficiaries. Don't they love you?
Well, of course they do.
How much?
Very much.
Well, then if you got killed, chances are they wouldn't even want to go on.
Absurd. People have to go on.
Even H-bomb survivors?
All right. You've made your point, but my time is limited, so if you'll please get a new application.
No. I wasn't fooling. I'm not going to sell you a policy.
They sell them out at the airport, George, in machines. I only came here out of friendship.
Show friendship to the people of this town. Give them some insurance.
Did you know chickens and eggs are highly resistant to radiation?
No.
Very interesting.
You're not thinking of building a shelter.
Certainly not. You know my feelings on that subject.
Yes.
As if man could bury his head in the ground and hide from responsibility.
Some people have different ideas of responsibility.
Yes, I'm familiar with the wide variations that exist in that area.
Mrs. Wakeman told me they're putting a shelter in her apartment house.
If they want to build shelters in their homes, that's fine with me. But why a school? A place for enlightenment should suddenly become a center for war preparations.
I'll tell you why. If we had a shelter and something happened while Holly was in school, do you think I could stay in the shelter? Not knowing what was happening to my child, whether or not she was protected, I would run to that school to be with her. And nobody could stop me, Bill. Nobody.
It was 2 weeks later, at a public meeting in Jackson High, that I saw Councilman Groves again. First item on the agenda was a plea for money for the high school band. After which Mr. Allen had permission to address the group on community shelters. As always, he included a definition of fallout.
When a nuclear weapon explodes, many tons of vaporized earth are sucked up into the cloud, and there they become radioactive. These radioactive particles fall back to the earth up to hundreds of miles from the point of explosion, forming a dangerous blanket over buildings, fields, and roads. Exposure to a large amount of fallout radiation can cause severe sickness and could result in death within a few weeks. But the danger is a temporary one, since fallout decays rather rapidly after a nuclear blast. 7 hours later, radiation level is down to 10% of the original level. 2 days later, it's down to 1%. 2 weeks later, down to 1/10 of 1%, which means that the first 2 weeks are the critical ones in which to be sheltered, assuming, of course, that you have survived the initial explosion.
Question.
Yes?
How far do you have to be from the blast to live through it?
Well, let's take a 20 megaton surface burst. You would have a good chance of surviving if you were more than 12 miles from the point of detonation, provided you knew what to do.
Well, what do you do?
A number of things. The first sign of a nuclear explosion is a blinding flash of light. That means about 3 seconds before the heat or thermal wave. During those few seconds, you should try to get away from windows and behind something solid. That would minimize the burn effect, which lasts about 5 seconds. Then you would have about 1 minute to seek maximum cover before the blast. If possible, go below the surface of the ground. After the blast is over, the fallout will not begin for at least 30 minutes. Time to reach a shelter where you can remain for several days.
How do you know when to come out?
In a private shelter, you'd be notified by radio announcement. In a mass or community shelter, the director would tell you when it's safe to come out.
Who's he?
He's the man in charge of the shelter. He'd be somebody in your neighborhood with leadership experience.
Suppose the director doesn't get to the shelter in time.
There's a regular chain of succession. That's all worked out in advance by the community.
What if I'm in one shelter and my husband's in another? Is there some way we could communicate?
Are you sure he'd want to, Harriet?
There would be regular radio broadcasts with news of survivors and outside conditions.
If we're going to have community shelters, why are they still pushing family shelters? Or do I just have an old pamphlet?
The family shelters are still the best answer for people on farms or in other isolated areas. And if the people in the cities and towns want extra protection at home, we certainly don't discourage them.
What happens when you come out of the shelter? Is there anything left outside?
The fact that you've survived the initial blast will mean that a great deal remains outside. There'll be decontamination teams trained to clear necessary surface areas, such as stores where food supplies exist.
Will the food be safe to eat?
Most of it, yes. Canned foods and packaged foods are safe if the outside containers are washed. Fruits and vegetables can be eaten if they are washed and peeled. And meat that's been covered is fine if it hasn't been spoiled by lack of refrigeration.
Can you drink the water outside?
Water from most underground sources. Water that's been in pipes or tanks is fine. As for rivers and streams and lakes, normal flow and settling will get rid of most of the contamination within a few days.
May I say a word, sir?
Yes.
I've been sitting here for 15 minutes listening to you, and I'm appalled that you would lull these people into a false sense of security.
I wasn't aware of any lulling.
Why, you gave me the impression that we would be safe in these so-called community shelters.
Safe from fallout, yes.
Is it not a fact that blast and fire are by far the most deadly of all thermonuclear effects? And that when the bomb hits, our homes will be pulverized?
That would happen within a few miles of the burst, in a direct target area. I'm speaking of places where there are survivors.
Do you mean to imply that we would not be a direct target area?
I don't know whether we would or whether we wouldn't.
Not a direct target area with our up-to-date chemical plant and our modern county airport only 2 miles away?
I can tell you from reliable sources that the enemy wouldn't have enough weapons to hit every plant and every population center in the United States.
And I say we're a prime target area, sir, and that nothing can save us.
You're making a lot of assumptions, sir. I'd like to point out that... May I have your attention, please? Please, may I have your attention?
I would like to answer the gentleman's comments, if I may. Sir, your remarks are familiar to me. I have thought them myself. I have felt them myself. The feeling of futility, of doom. And I have felt the opposite, too. The sureness that it could never happen. That it was much too horrible to happen. Then one day, realized that these two apparently opposite views had much in common. Both led to complete inaction. Both allowed me the leisure of doing nothing of my unique predicament as a 20th century man. I had faced two possibilities: world peace and world destruction. I was notably reluctant to face the third, the possibility of a nuclear war in which some will survive. The most difficult of all to face because it requires intense preparation, sacrifice, money, for a day we hope will never come. If it doesn't, and the world is spared, who will care how much these things have cost? If it comes, and we are ready, then whatever we have spent beforehand will be cheap. You might say a form of insurance. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask your assistance in financing the construction of shelters in our public schools.
Tomorrow morning, I shall propose to the Common Council an ordinance by which the town corporation will share with those civic groups who wish to contribute the expenses of incorporating shelter facilities into our public schools.
Chain reactions are easier to start than to stop. Within a few days, plans were drawn up for a shelter in Grammar School 2, a shelter that doubled as a badly needed cafeteria. While other schools, work has begun to raise shielding to minimum protective levels. And it wasn't just schools. It was many buildings, public and private. In some, much work remains to be done, and will be done, because people have started to care. Like these doctors and nurses who've begun to give self-care medical lectures to housewives and businessmen, vital knowledge for shelter living. And the radio hams who came forth with the skill and equipment needed for emergency broadcasts in case of attack. Community action, no telling where it'll end. You know the town, the one just over the county line, the one with a good Chinese restaurant, and the movie theater that smells of popcorn. Come around and have some. We'll be here.